very good evening. You're watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. 3 days to go to the big Trump visit and excitement is at fever pitch. Donald Trump is clearly as excited to visit India, and his biggest draw seems to be the promise of 7 million. That's right, 7 million people who will apparently greet him when he touches down at Ahmedabad. A Hello Trump rally at Motera Stadium will follow on the likes of the Howdy Modi rally in Texas, which saw PM Modi address huge crowds. It's bound to be a visual spectacle. But let's talk a bit about the boring but important stuff as well. Like the elusive trade deal that we want. Like how we got moved out of a program for developing countries that helped Indian exports to the US at lower tariffs. About issues like data localization that US tech companies are fretting about. About the fact that POTUS keeps offering to mediate in Kashmir, which India is not interested in. But before we get down to the real questions, let's play out for you what Trump said about the trip.
Well, we can have a trade deal with India, but I'm really saving the big deal for later on. We're doing a very big trade deal with India. We'll have it. I don't know if it'll be done before the election, but we'll have a very big deal with India. We're not treated very well by India, but I happen to like Prime Minister Modi a lot. And he told me we'll have 7 million people between the airport and the event. And the stadium, I understand, is sort of semi under construction, but it's going to be the largest stadium in the world. So it's going to be very exciting. But he says between the stadium and the airport, we'll have about 7 million people. So it's going to be very exciting. I hope you all enjoy it. Are you going?
Yeah, in that clip, Donald Trump follows by asking a host of, US journalists whether they're going or, who all are going. So he's very excited. We're all excited. But what is India going to get out of it? Because that truly is the big question. To speak on this, I'm joined today by Sushant Sareen, Strategic Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at ORF. Meera Shankar, former diplomat to the USA, former ambassador, in fact, to the USA. Welcome to all of you and thank you for speaking with us today as we kick off our coverage of the big Trump visit on the show. Ms. Shankar, let me begin with you. Of course, Trump enthusiastic mostly about that 7 million crowd. The Hello Trump seems to be our return gift for Howdy Modi. Why is he so excited about a big crowd here? And the fact is that Trump has visited India towards, the end of his tenure when he's up for re-election. What should we really make of this trip?
Well, better late than never. Earlier we were in a position where US presidents didn't normally visit India during their term. This was something which changed in recent years. And President Clinton, President George Bush, as well as President Obama had all visited India. In fact, President Obama twice, once during each of his terms. So I think it would have been a noticeable omission to have an India-US strategic partnership, which is becoming stronger, and at the same time to have a noticeable absence of a presidential visit by Trump during his first term. So I think it's better late than never. Clearly, it's a standalone visit, which is important. But for President Trump, I think it also plays to his domestic agenda at home, which will be caught up in the presidential election campaign. While the Indian American community of around between 3 to 4 million is not so large, it's politically very active and it's economically a very strong community. They are good funders of political party. They participate in American politics in a very active way. And the majority of Indian Americans have been Democratic, have tended to vote for the Democratic Party, while the rich Indian Americans have tended to vote for the Republicans. Now, clearly for President Trump, getting more support from the Indian American community would be something which he would look forward to.
Sushant Sareen, the key question about what this means for us, Meera Shankar very rightly saying that at least Trump has visited before he's ended his first term. He's, of course, hoping for a second term. what do you decode? Because, you know, nowadays you have to figure out who speaks Trump. What do you decode from his speech when he says that I'll have a deal, but the big deal will be before November, maybe a little deal now? What deal do you think he's talking about?
Look, frankly, I can't decipher Mr. Trump any better than you can or anybody else can. And he can come up with anything whenever he wants to. But I think let's look at it from a different angle. You know, normally Trump is so focused on trade and he ignores virtually everything else. But here it is a situation where he's coming virtually half the globe away without a trade deal and yet is very enthusiastic about a visit. So let us also be clear in our own minds that, you know, we keep talking about a strategic relationship with the Americans, and then in our normal discourse, we keep talking about the transactional elements of that strategic relationship. Now, here is a case where the transactional elements have somewhat receded into the background, and we are looking now at the larger strategic relationship. I think that, to my mind, is the larger significance of this visit than anything else. On the trade issue, frankly, Tamanna, you know, to an extent, we have been hoist on our own petard. We have been boasting about our $3 trillion economy for God knows when and going on to $5 trillion in the next 4-5 years. And little realizing that even though it might sound very big in absolute terms, in relative terms, you are still a $2,000 per capita economy. And, you know, when you do this kind of grandstanding, the other side kind of calls your bluff and says, okay, fine, if you have arrived, you know, in the way you claim that you have arrived, then let's have a far more equitable trading relationship. And that is when you start balking. So I think we also need to be a little clear about how much we boast and how much we, you know, do this grandstanding. But I think even then, the trade deal will go through. I think the trade deal, from what one is hearing, has more or less been sealed, but there are a couple of things which remain outstanding, and they don't want to rush into it, and for good reason. You know, for reasons you yourself mentioned, whether it's data localization, whether it's a whole range of other things, whether it's on agricultural trade, because after all, you know, you can't sign a deal purely on strategic grounds to further a strategic relationship and then have a political mess on your hands, you know, because of the kind of political fallout that deal will happen, will wreak on your own politics. Exactly. So I think both sides are moving ahead. And I think that is what is the strength of the relationship rather than the weakness of the relationship. And to my mind, that is what we need to start focusing on rather than, you know, $2 billion here, $3 billion here. Although I must say in all earnestness, but that is precisely what Trump is famous for. That he looks for these small things which he gets, and to an extent he ignores the larger strategic dimension of the relationship. The only difference is that this time around, he's not ignoring the strategic dimension of the relationship, but he's putting the transactional part of the relationship a little into the background, and I think that is what we need to look at very carefully.
Interesting angle there, Meera Shankar. What's your take on that? Trump is the guy who likes to say he walked away with a deal, but I don't know how a deal works out for him ahead of elections, because he is a politician who's going to look at how things play out domestically.
Well, clearly for India, some of the recent decisions that the US has taken about withdrawing GSP, about saying that India will no longer be treated as a developing country, I think these do hit at India-US trade. And I think it may be difficult for President Trump at this stage in the run-up to elections to actually make concessions on some of these things. So if we want a trade deal where there's a degree of give and take, where both sides get something, then I think maybe the US hand will be constrained at this time. On our side too, I think there are issues because there's a sense that the US keeps moving the goalpost and asking for additional items. So let's see if something works out. It'll be a small trade deal if it works out. And if it doesn't, I think President Trump has kind of set the stage for minimizing the impact of that, saying that we will have a deal. It may not be now, it may be later, it may be even after the elections. Now, there are two aspects to the relationship, and I think one aspect has been moving ahead very well, and that is the strategic partnership overall, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that's where the focus is going to be. The defense partnership, the counter-terrorism partnership have become more robust, and perhaps we may see some agreements emerging in those areas. For instance, India has decided to procure helicopters from the US, and the US has also moved the Congress for permission to sell India an integrated air defense system, which would likely be used as a shield for Delhi. So on these and other issues, you know, the extent of intelligence sharing, the extent of sharing of strategic perceptions, on all that, I think the relationship has been moving well, and we are likely to see focus on that as part of the overall India-US strategic partnership. Because for both countries, you know, the question of balancing China in Asia has acquired importance. US-China strategic competition has heated up, including over the question of who will dominate the technologies of the future. And we are seeing this, you know, in the whole debate over the 5G and whether Huawei should be allowed to participate in it. So these aspects of the US global concern with regard to China's dominance in Asia will, you know, be the steering factor for the relationship. In Afghanistan, on the other hand, any precipitate US withdrawal, and it looks like the US is getting ready for a deal with the Taliban, would raise some concerns. And it's very important that the two countries discuss this and with frankness, and also how, you know, they can work towards a reasonably sustainable situation in Afghanistan were the US to withdraw. For instance, continuing support to the Afghan army financially from the US would be very important. Otherwise, you know, you are looking at a possible dire situation for the Afghan forces.
Let me come to the issue of strategic points that will be talked about in this trip. Sushant, Meera Shankar, of course, went through some of them in great detail. But one which she hasn't spoken about and which we must talk about is the K word. You know, Trump has again and again offered to mediate on Kashmir when nobody really has asked him to. India doesn't want him to. And it seems to be a popular thing that he wants to say every time he meets India or Pakistan. Do you think he will refrain? There will be restraint this time round?
Look, I think we are reading too much into this offer on Kashmir. I think he's probably doing it because he also has a line to plug with the Pakistanis. And he's trying to plug that line with the Pakistanis, clearly with Afghanistan in mind. So let me first deal with this Kashmir thing. I think it's, in a sense, it's kind of irritating, but it's kind of become a new normal that he will offer his good offices and we will very politely reject his good offices. And that's where matters lie. Nobody's pushing that envelope beyond that. There is some speculation that will his son-in-law now, take up this whole Indo-Pak and Kashmir thing and come out with another peace plan. But if they come out with a kind of a peace plan like they've come out in the case of Palestine, favoring Israel, and they do something similar for us in Kashmir, I don't see any reason why we should be averse to it. But other than that, we can very simply reject it. And I think we should behave like a somewhat more confident nation and not tilt at the windmills every time somebody says something. That's been some of our problem, that we always tilt every time somebody says something, and we must be self-assured on this. On the Afghanistan question, where, while I agree with what Ambassador Meera Shankar is saying, that we need to have a conversation with the Americans, I think we must also realize our limitations insofar as Afghanistan is concerned. The fact of the matter remains, we neither influence the peace process, nor can we influence the war out there. So in a manner of speaking, whatever dynamic is at play in Afghanistan, we are, waiting and watching how that cookie will crumble, and then maybe we will have to decide what our next course of action is going to be. Yes, if the Americans were to walk out, if the Taliban were to capture Afghanistan, then yes, there will be a major setback, at least for the foreseeable future. But like I always say, in Afghanistan, there is never an end game. Every end game is the beginning of a new great game. You just have to see your opportunities when you can step back into that great game. Just a word more on the entire trade thing. This business of the Americans withdrawing GSP and labeling us as a developed country, this is where our dilemma comes in. Our politicians love it when somebody in the West calls us a developed country, little realizing the consequences that kind of a label has on the kind of trade concessions and other issues related to trade, how that those get impacted every time somebody puts you in the category of a developed country. So at one level, we want to, or we covet the label of not being treated as a third world, a less developed country. We want to be treated as one of the guys who have arrived. At another level, the moment you are treated like that, you suddenly realize that there is a price to be paid. So we need to be very clear in our heads what exactly we want. And that is why whatever we say publicly, I think we should be a little measured when we start gloating about our $3 trillion economy, because at the end of the day, like I said earlier, it just means a $2,000 per capita income, and we have a long way to go before we can actually consider ourselves to be part of the developed world.
No, at the end of the day, all of this is about what's the deal, and that's something that Trump is great at, right? Meera Shankar, from our point of view, what are we going to be looking at? And just your comment on this point that Sushant made, because you've seen a lot of politicians crowing about the fact that we're no longer being considered as a developed nation, but that means that we don't get the incentives that we need, and especially that our exports need. So what is going to be the nuance of this deal? Say we say we give in on Harley Davidson, that take your Harley Davidson tariffs, we'll slash them, it's okay, but get us back on GSP. What are the kind of contours of the deal that you think will pan out here?
Well, I don't really know what the final details are because they're still being discussed. But speculation has been that India was ready to offer certain access for their medical devices, removing the price cap for high-level devices, maybe certain agricultural commodities, entry into the Indian market, some of the commodities on which we had put tariffs, such as, almonds and stuff like that, cranberries, etc. And on the other side, India's expectation was that we would also get access for some of our products, such as mangoes or grapes, and overall restoration of GSP. So I don't know where the package is right now, but some package could emerge. And if it doesn't, then both countries will probably not let that be a stumbling block in the visit. They will move on. They will say they will continue their discussion and a deal could emerge later. But clearly, I think the focus is going to be on the strategic partnership, on the convergences in the Indo-Pacific, on the building up on what has been achieved in the defense partnership, in the counter-terrorism partnership. For India, access to technology is an important aspect. I don't know how far we have made progress on the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, which was actually designed to strengthen India's indigenous defense production capabilities with joint research, joint development, joint production. I don't think that has taken off very far, but discussions are ongoing. And some of the agreements which were reached recently,
right,
for instance, the technology security agreement, which would enable private companies to share and part with technology, should actually be enablers in this process. So how do we build on this and take it forward?
Absolutely. A lot on that list. Sushant, you wanted to come in? Any closing comments on what you see panning out in this trip? And of course, all the body language experts are going to be wheeled out over the next week when Modi meets Trump and who is hugged how tightly. But that apart, let's stick today to what we really get out of the deal.
So here is the thing. I think the way this trip will pan out is that, number one, it will be a visual spectacle.
Yeah.
I think we will create the grand Indian tamasha and everybody will love it. So that is one. But on the more substantive issues, I think there are a couple of defense deals which are likely to be at least inked during this particular thing, or at least some kind of an understanding or some kind of an announcement is to be made. There will be, of course, conversations. But I think what is extremely important is, Ambassador Meera Shankar was talking about the Indo-Pacific. Are we clear on what exactly are the contours of our Indo-Pacific strategy? We know that we need to balance out the Chinese, but how far are we willing to go with the Americans and how far are the Americans willing to go with us? I don't think there's a whole lot of clarity on how this entire dynamic is going to play out. So I would really like, but that's not going to happen at only the level of the summit meeting. It has to happen at various levels, before it goes up to the summit leaving, and probably at the next summit that could be taken up. So that is one. On the other thing, I think we also need a lot of clarity in India on this whole defense technology, defense transactions we are getting into. No company is going to part with its crown jewels just because they've fallen in love with India. Nobody is going to be that much of an Indophile. They love their money and they love their technology too much. Yeah. Ultimately, if you manage to get them to start some kind of make in India kind of a scheme, you will then gradually be able to absorb that technology, learn from it, have people who then set off on their own. But we also need a kind of a policy framework out here which encourages private sector in defense management, because the public sector clearly has not been able to deliver the goods. Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the kind of soup we are in. Right. So we need a private sector in defense, but we also need a whole lot of clarity on how that private sector participation has to take in defense. Absolutely. That is what will fuel innovation. That is what is fuel fabrication. That is what will fuel everything else.
Absolutely.
So I think we need our own clarity before we go.
No, I'm sure the top diplomatic team preparing for this visit has its points marked. But I get your point, Sushant, and it's an important one, because Make in India and defense is something that we've been hearing about for at least the last 6 years. We haven't really managed to see it in practice. Just because you're buying doesn't mean they'll give you your technology. A lot of fine details that will be talked about over the next few days. But for now, the preparations are immense. There's going to be a massive show of Indian hospitality when Trump touches down in Gujarat. Coverage will of course continue, but for now, thank you so much, Sushant Sareen and Meera Shankar, for speaking with us today.